During the month of September, I want to take a look at the letters to the 7 churches of Asia. These letters are really Christ's evaluation of a group of churches there in what we would think of as the western portion of the country of Turkey. There were 7 of them. 2 out of the 7 were highly commended, and the other 5 were in some way criticized for various things that they did or did not do. And we're going to take a look at those churches as we go along. Churches are evaluated all the time by people, both as individuals and as groups. They're evaluated by elders. They're evaluated particularly, tongue-in-cheek, by preachers. I remember when I was in school at Lipscomb, Brother A.C. Pulias taught a class in the New Testament church. And he made mention in that class that people have a way of evaluating churches today. And there are 3 things that they usually talk about. What are those 3 things? Attendance, contribution, and their facilities. Now, we might add a 4th to it. Once in a while, people will talk about evaluation of churches in reference to how many people have you baptized this year. All of these things are external, and it isn't to say at all that these things are not important. But we need to see these things simply as tools to do the mission of Christ in the church. It's interesting to me that in none of the letters to the 7 churches of Asia did Jesus say anything about what a nice building you have. They didn't have such things as church buildings in those days. It was not until about the year 240 that we have evidence of the first church building. And it was just a converted home. And it was not until 311 A.D. that it was legal for churches to even own property. It was at that time that Emperor Constantine declared that Christianity was a legal religion. Now, some people say he declared Christianity to be the official religion of the Roman Empire. That's not what he did. He simply declared Christianity had a right to exist. Up until that time, Christianity did not have a right to exist, and that's where the catacombs came in, and the Christians would hide and worship God together in a variety of places. Well, Jesus, when he evaluated the churches in like I say, in Asia Minor, he didn't say anything about church building. He didn't say anything about their contributions. He did make mention of the fact that one of them had the idea, we are very rich, but he says, you're not, you're poor, you're miserable, you're blind. But he didn't say anything about what the contributions were. Not only that, but he didn't say anything about how many people are attending. Now, we know from history that churches in the 1st century particularly, and on into the 2nd century, churches were very small. This congregation would probably be considered a medium, maybe even a large congregation back in the 1st century and the 2nd century. The notable exception to that is the church in Jerusalem, where the Jews on Pentecost, 3,000 of them became Christians. But other than that, we don't have a record of any large churches. And so when Christ evaluated the churches, when he summarized these things, he didn't say a word about what their attendance was. Now, does this mean that contribution, attendance, and facilities, and baptisms, and so forth, that these things are unimportant? No, but it does call attention to the fact that we need to learn to distinguish between what is important and what is most important. And the important things are tools that we can use to do the most important things. And this is the thesis of the letters to these 7 churches. And these criteria are not unimportant, the three that I mentioned. They are not unimportant, but they are not the object. They are not the goal. They are not the reason for the church to be in existence. Well, once in a while I'll tune into a program on TV, a religious program, and they go out and they show these great big church buildings. They show these great big audiences, thousands of people. That's okay, but that's not the goal. The goal is not how many we can count. The goal is how many we can count who can be counted on to do the things that are the mission of the church. And so these letters, although congregational, these letters are intensely personal. And it causes us, or it ought to cause us, everyone to stop and think about, how am I fitting in to the most important things? Not just the important things. How am I fitting in to the most important things in this whole thing? Well, what did he say are the most important things? I'm not going to go through all of them, but as we study these things over the course of this month, we will see these things constantly coming up as Jesus says, this is good, this is bad, here's what you need to do. Here are some things that he mentioned, though. The church must be sound in truth. The church must oppose false teaching. He mentions this a number of times. Christians must pursue a high moral, ethical life. They had trouble with that back then. Oh, gee whiz, we have trouble with that today, don't we? Strong churches, he says, pursue a life of high, ethical, moral Christian standards. He also says churches must not leave their first love. Now we're going to talk about that when we get to Ephesus. He says, in Ephesus, he says, I have this against you. You've left your first love. Now, I don't like to think about that about myself. I don't like to think about that in reference to a congregation. They have left their first love. It really says, what are your priorities? As a congregation, as an individual, what are your priorities? What is most important to you? Or have you left that? Now, today we're going to talk about two churches. The church at Smyrna and the church in Philadelphia. I remember when I was a little boy, my parents used to read the stories of the seven churches to us at night before we go to bed sometime. And I remember the church in Philadelphia. Oh, I didn't know he was talking about Pennsylvania. And that's what I was thinking, you know. Well, no, that was not Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. There was a city over in the eastern part, over in the western part of what is now Turkey. There was a city over there named Philadelphia. And so this is the thing. 7 churches, the 2 we'll talk about today, not a single condemnation was brought against them. They were commended for the things that they were standing for. Then the worst church, and by the way, I'll leave this one to the last, the worst church that we have is a church at Laodicea. And he says, you are not hot and you're not cold. You're lukewarm. You're lukewarm. And he uses a very strong word when he says, you know, since you're neither hot nor cold but lukewarm, I'm going to vomit you up. And that's literally what he said. That's what the word, I will spew you out of my mouth. If you look that up in a Greek-English lexicon, you'll find that that word means to vomit. It makes me sick in my stomach to know of a lukewarm church. Now I have to ask my question, am I a part of the lukewarmness of the church? But we'll say that until the end of the series. Now let's just take a general look at the setting here, because the setting in which Jesus wrote these letters or dictated these letters to John, the setting is very vivid and turned out to be very important. So let me read from the first chapter of Revelation, beginning with the 12th verse. John heard a noise, and he turned around to see the voice that was speaking to me. And when I turned, I saw 7 golden lampstands. And among the lampstands was someone like a son of man, dressed in a robe reaching down to his feet, with a golden sash around his chest. His head and hair were white like wool, white as snow, and his eyes were like blazing fire. His feet were like bronze glowing in a furnace, and his voice was like the sound of rushing waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp 2-edged sword. His face was like the sun, shining in all of its brightness. Wow. Boy, isn't that some description? Just imagine that in your own mind. What Jesus Christ looked like in his royalty, in his victory. He has conquered Satan. He has died on the cross. He's been raised from the dead. He is seated at the right hand of God. And now here John is describing him. And this regal, beautiful, magnificent Son of God is standing there before John. And then as he goes on in that chapter, in verse 20, John, he says, John, here's what all of this means. You know, the stars and the candlestands and so forth. The mystery of the 7 stars that you saw in my right hand and the 7 golden lampstands. It is this. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches. Now listen, this is a zinger. The 7 lampstands are the 7 churches. Now, here is Jesus standing amidst these lampstands. Jesus amidst the church. All of these congregations, and he's looking around at them, and he says, I'm going to write you a letter. To each one of you, I'm going to write a letter and describe what you are in my eyes, not what you are in reference to how you evaluate yourself. I want to evaluate you myself. This majestic description of Christ shows him standing there amidst the churches. Well, you know, we don't know very much about these churches. The only church that's listed here, Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. That's the 7 churches. Ephesus is the only one that we know anything much about. Now, the church in Thyatira may have been started, emphasis may, speculation, may have been started by Lydia, who had lived in Philippi as a salesperson. She was a seller of purple, but she came from Thyatira. And so there's speculation that maybe she went back to Thyatira and began the church there. We don't know. But there was a church in Thyatira, which was right there close to the coast of the sea. Well, what about Ephesus? The book of Ephesus in our Bible is one of the glorious books that tell us about Christ and the church. It tells us about Christ as the head of the church, and it is a gorgeous book to read. Some of the books in the New Testament just seem to grab your attention, and Ephesians is one of them. The letter of Paul written to the church. Now that was written somewhere in the neighborhood of 62. Paul was in jail in Rome at the time that he wrote that book. Now John writes in about the year AD 90. So there's quite a few years have transpired. When Paul leaves Ephesus, Ephesus is a great place, a great city, a great church. He writes back to them and so forth. And now we have a different story that we'll talk about when we look at the church at Ephesus. The church in Laodicea is mentioned in the book of Colossians only a mention is made of it. Nothing about what it was like, nothing about its Jew, Gentile population or anything like this. It just mentions the church in Laodicea. And so we don't know very much about these churches at all. Let's take a look at one of the churches that we're going to look at this morning, the church in Smyrna. Well, the church in Smyrna was a good church. I wish we knew more about that church. Jesus says to the church in Smyrna, and I want you to get the feel of this. Jesus is speaking to the church there in Smyrna. He says, I know your affliction. I know your poverty, but you're really rich. And then he goes on and he says, I know the slander from those who call themselves Jews, but really they are a synagogue of Satan. But he says, I know about them. We need to remember that Christ knows the situation at Burbank. Christ knows the situation at all of the churches. Now, how do I fit personally into this? When he sees the congregation at Burbank, what does he say? When he sees me as a member of the congregation, what does he say about me? And so it turns out to be a very, very important thing because it's Christ's own evaluation of the church. In Hebrews chapter 5, Paul reminds us, the writer of Hebrews reminds us of something. Paul himself in other books, Paul talks about some of these very same things. But here's what he says. He is able, Christ, he is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and who are going astray, since he himself has been subject to weakness. That is a great statement, folks. He himself is subject to weakness. He is able to bear gently with you. Do you see the compassion of Christ as he evaluates this church in Smyrna? Do you see his sympathy? Do you see his empathy in reference to that congregation? He says, I know the tough times that you're having. I know the difficulties that you're going through. I know the persecution. I know the scornful things that have been said. And so Christ deals very gently with his church. Why? Because he knows the people. He knows them. He knows what they need. And so these are compassionate statements. What does he say that he knows? One of the things he says is, I know you're suffering. I know you're suffering. I know your hardships that you are bearing for the truth. Folks, it isn't how big we are. Yes, I'd like to see us grow. You would like to see us grow. But the numbers is not the thing. The bigness is not the thing. It's the spirit of the church. It's the spirit of who we are, what we are doing, how involved are we in the life of the congregation itself? Or is it simply something where I live my Christian life every day, I come to church on Sunday? Or am I really involved in the compassion of the church? Am I really involved in, well, in this case, in the fact that the church was scorned? Am I scorned? Well, Christ deals gently with his people, and he deals with them on a realistic basis. He said, this is the way things really are. And he has compassion in these statements. He recognizes that they're suffering hardships. He doesn't tell us exactly what those hardships were. Maybe that's a good thing, because there are all different kinds of hardships that people suffer. There's the hardship of disappointment. Every one of us has had that. We've had that in reference to families, to friends, business, congregations. We've suffered disappointment. We suffered discouragement everywhere. Family, friends, business, church. Discouragements. He says, I know you're suffering. I know your hardships. And then he goes on and says, this is for truth. Am I suffering anything for the truth? Am I sacrificing anything for the truth? Or am I just kind of part of a social organization? Well, he goes on and says, something else that I know about you. You're a bunch of poor people. You're poor. You don't have very much in the way of money to work with and all of this. You're poor. But let me tell you something. You're really rich. You're really rich. No, I'm not talking about finances. I'm not talking about money in the bank. I'm talking about your spirit. You are rich in faith. You're rich in truth. You're rich in work for God. You're rich in carrying out His mission. You see, God doesn't evaluate me the way I evaluate my bank account. He evaluates me in reference to what am I producing in congregation? What am I, how am I involved in the work of the congregation? And so he says, yes, the disappointments. Well, the size of the crowds, the contribution, the church, the building facade. Nothing said about that, folks. Nothing said about that. We have to see these things as tools for us to work with so that we can become the kind of people, the kind of congregation that Smyrna was. And so what does he say? He says, well, I measure the church in a different way than the 21st century people measure the church. What does he say for them? He says, stick in times of difficulty. Stay with it. When disappointments come, don't pack up your dolls and leave. Paul never did that. Jesus never did that. You need to have a willingness to stand for God and for His truth. That was a commendation that he gave to the church there in Smyrna. It means to resolve to stick with God's people through thick and thin, through good and bad, through successes and failures. It means to be a faithful servant. Well, let's take a look for a moment now at the church at Philadelphia. There's no condemnation of anything here, just like Smyrna. Only commending. He commended them. He complimented them. But he begins again by saying, I know your deeds. I know. I know your deeds. He says, I know your deeds. And then something that is so vivid, I think, in reference to the Burbank congregation, he says, I know your deeds, but see, I have opened a door for you, and no man can shut it. We have an open door right here in our backyard, and our front yard, and both side yards. We have an open door in this little town of Burbank, in this neighborhood. And the question is, what are we doing with the open door? He commended these people. He said, I have opened a door and nobody can shut it. Isn't Christ saying some of these same things to the Burbank church? And then he uses something that I think, again, is very applicable to us. He says, I know that you have a little strength. This is an interesting statement because it can be translated in two different ways. I know you have a little strength. Well, does this mean that we did have a lot and now we're shrunk and we only have a little strength left? Christ says to him, if that's the case, use the strength that you have. If that's the way things are, be what God wants you to be regardless of how weak you might feel that you are. You have a little strength. Now use that little strength. Well, there's a peculiarity here, because it can be translated, you have a little strength. You used to have a lot, now you've got just a little. But the indefinite article a, you have a little strength. The indefinite article a is not in the Greek. The Greek does not have anything like an indefinite article. It has a definite article, the, but it doesn't have an indefinite article. And so when a noun comes up where there's no definite article, it's taken either as a or just as a blanket statement. Now, let's look at it from a little different point of view. What if he said, instead of saying you have a little strength, what if he said you have little strength? You never were very strong. You never did have great leadership. You never did have great preachers. You never did have great teachers. But you do have a little strength. When we have a little strength, sometimes we say, well, we can't do anything. And when we have a little, just very little strength, very little leadership, very little preaching, very little teaching, some people will say, well, I won't get out of that and go to a strong church. No, that's not what these people did. And Jesus encouraged them and said, you have little strength, but use it. Use the strength that you have. Use the abilities that you have. That's his message. And then he promises them, he said, since you have kept my commandments to endure patiently, I will also keep you from an hour of trial that is going to come upon the whole world to test those who live on the earth. Now, persecutions were going to come to these people. Deprivations were going to come to these people. But he says, the fact that you are struggling, the fact that you're in fear, I'm going to tell you, I'll protect you. He didn't say I would relieve you of the persecution, I will relieve you of the suffering, but I'm going to be with you. I'm going to protect you. You know, when I know that I have God's support, it's so much better for me than if I feel like, God, where are you? I wish God were with me. No, that isn't it. We have his support. Christ doesn't forget us. Christ doesn't set us aside and thoughtlessly forget us. Instead, well, like again in the book of Hebrews, the writer there says, God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love that you have for him and for the people that you help. God doesn't forget that. He doesn't forget our past. But he says to us in other places, don't live in the past. Don't just simply rely on the past. Live in the present and do what you can, though you have very little strength. You may have been strong at one time, now you're not so strong, but use the strength that you have to glorify your Heavenly Father. Well, some say, well, what's the use? However, the writer here is emphasizing to us, remember your own personal responsibilities. He's saying to the church in Philadelphia, I won't forget your goodness. I won't forget your past. But in the present, I want you to know I'm with you. I want to help you. I want to encourage you. Now, the question comes down to me, how am I going to respond to that great offer of Christ that he is going to be with us? Personal responsibility from within the congregation is very important. I made a little note here to myself. Christ never gave up Paul never left the city because he was discouraged with the church. Peter never gave up because of the problems that he saw in the church at Jerusalem. The same could be said for James and John and all of the apostles. They simply never gave up. When I was teaching communication over in Vienna, I read the very short speech that Winston Churchill gave during the Second World War. The morale of the English people was very low. They were being bombed. They were being defeated in so many ways. Churchill went and visited the old high school that he had attended at Harrow. And he made a short speech. This speech had been set aside, and it is as if he just got up, made these other words, and then sat down. That's not the way it was a part of his whole speech. I read his whole speech. It's not very long. But here is the part that is remembered, and you know it as well as I. Never give up. Never give up, he said. Never, never, never give up. And that's what Christ is saying to the church. Never give up. The church at Burbank, we're not very large, but we're probably larger than the church in Philadelphia or the church at Smyrna. We're not very strong, but we probably have a lot more money in this congregation than the church at Philadelphia had. We are not dynamic. We don't have a dynamic preacher. We don't have dynamic teachers. We don't have a lot of classes and things like that. But that's not what he talks about. Instead, he says, be faithful to the very point of death. You know, when I was a kid, I remember hearing over and over, be thou faithful until death, and I will give you the crown of life. That is not what he said. He did not use the word until. He used the Greek word that is translated unto, which means to be faithful even to the point of. What did he say? Be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. Don't you know that was so encouraging to these people? Don't you know that the compassion of Christ in a struggling church, in a church filled with fear because there's so much opposition to them, in a church that was poverty-stricken. But he says to these churches, be faithful. That's what I want you to do. Be faithful. Be faithful to the point of death. I will give you the crown of life. What is Christ saying to the Burbank church today? Oh, I kind of think he's saying the same thing today that he said back then. Hold to truth. Hold to your faith. Don't fear, and you will survive. You will survive. We're going to sing an invitation song. If you're not a Christian today and you want to become a Christian, if you've never been baptized into Christ and you want to be in Christ, we invite you to come. Let's stand together to sing.